On June 7, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was still burning from the Battle of Midway, and the world had not yet understood what would unfold across the next 3 years. Japan believed that the United States, humiliated by Pearl Harbor, would break under pressure. But something unexpected was rising within the American ranks, a force trained to fight where no ordinary soldier could survive. They were young men shaped by violence, discipline, fear, and fury. What happened next turned into one of the most terrifying legends of World War II. Japanese soldiers began to whisper a name with respect, hatred, and fear: U.S. Marines. This story explains why. On June 7, 1942, the sun rose heavy over the Pacific. The waters were calm, but beneath that calm was a shifting tide of fate. The United States had just struck a stunning blow at Midway, sinking 4 Japanese carriers and halting Tokyo's unstoppable march across the ocean. Yet while Midway was a turning point for the strategy of war, it was not the moment that shifted the psychology of war. That would come weeks later, on an island few Americans had heard of and even fewer could pronounce: Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was not paradise. It was a steaming jungle swamp crawling with disease, venomous insects, suffocating humidity, and mud that swallowed boots whole. For Japan, the island was a launching point, a place where an airfield, once completed, could sever supply lines between America and Australia. For the United States, losing it meant losing the Pacific. And so, when the order came, the Marines knew exactly what was required: take the island, hold the island, no matter the cost. In August 1942, tens of thousands of Marines stormed ashore under the cover of smoky sky and pounding surf. They were terrified. Many had never tasted real combat before. They had no idea what jungle war was like, no idea what the Japanese were truly capable of. But there was something else inside them too: anger. After Pearl Harbor, after the humiliating defeats in the Philippines and Wake Island, they carried a fury that burned hotter than fear. The Japanese defenders had heard of the Marines, but they were not impressed, not yet. They believed Americans were soft, undisciplined, untested. Many Japanese officers believed their soldiers were spiritually superior, physically stronger, more prepared to die. Their expectation was simple: the Marines would crumble. Instead, Guadalcanal became the island where Japan learned a brutal, unforgettable truth. During those first days, the Marines attacked fast, sharp, and without hesitation. They cut through jungle thickets, set up defensive lines, and seized the unfinished airfield, later known as Henderson Field. The Japanese were shocked. They had expected hesitation, fear, retreat. Instead, they saw persistence. They saw aggression. They saw something they had not seen before: American troops who chose offense, even when outnumbered. Night on Guadalcanal was something else entirely. The jungle came alive with screams and gunfire, palms rustling under the movement of soldiers trying to survive. Japanese troops were trained to fight at night, to slip into enemy lines silently, to strike with bayonet and blade. They expected chaos and panic, but this too stunned them. The Marines did not break. They fought back, inch by inch, rifle by rifle, blade by blade. Some Japanese survivors later spoke of the eerie calm behind Marine positions, voices speaking softly, orders whispered, rifles reloaded with chilling steadiness. Many believed these men were not ordinary humans. They believed the Marines were capable of fighting without sleep, without fear, and without mercy. In truth, the Marines were afraid. They were exhausted. Many were shaking, sick, starving, dehydrated, and cut off from supply lines, but they fought anyway. The Japanese began calling the Marines teki kori, enemy demons. It wasn't an insult, it was respect. Still, the Marines were not invincible. Hunger gnawed at them, malaria spread through their ranks, rainstorms soaked their uniforms until skin peeled from flesh. Bullets ran low, and food shipments vanished beneath Japanese artillery fire. But when a man is cornered, something deeper awakens, something primal, something terrifying.
For weeks, the same scene repeated. The Japanese attacked at night with brutal ferocity, racing through jungle shadows with bayonets raised. The Marines answered with raw survival instincts, screaming into the dark, firing blindly until rifles clicked empty, then fighting with knives, shovels, fists, anything that could kill. It wasn't strategy anymore. It wasn't tactics. It was instinct. Kill or be killed. By dawn, the jungle floor was scattered with bodies. The Japanese, who believed surrender was shameful and death was honorable, pressed the attack again and again. They expected the Marines to fear them, to crumble under the psychological weight of death. But here was the paradox. The more Marines died, the more ferocious the survivors became. Letters discovered later revealed how Japanese troops slowly began to realize something terrifying. The Marines felt no fear of death. What they feared was failure. That created a different kind of soldier, a different kind of enemy. One night, under a sky ripped open by lightning and tracer fire, the Japanese launched what they believed would be the final attack. Thousands of soldiers charged Henderson Field in a tidal wave of steel and shouting voices. The Marines held the line with everything they had. Machine guns overheated, barrels melted, ammunition ran out. The Japanese climbed over their own dead to reach Marine trenches. A Marine named John Basilone grabbed a machine gun that was too hot to touch and fired it bare-handed until his skin blistered and burned. He killed so many attackers that the Japanese believed there were hundreds of Marines where there were only dozens. Basilone refused to retreat. He refused to abandon the gun. He refused to stop fighting even when blood poured from his hands.
The Japanese retreated into the jungle, stunned. They had faced something they did not expect. American soldiers who would literally let their flesh burn rather than give ground. From that night forward, a new belief spread through Japanese command. U.S. Marines were not ordinary men. They were warriors built for death, bred for combat, shaped by relentless training and impossible determination. More frightening still, they would never surrender. Guadalcanal dragged on for 6 brutal months. Battles raged across ridges, rivers, beaches, and jungles. Each victory cost blood. Each day was a struggle to survive hunger, fever, and exhaustion. But as the months passed, a pattern emerged. Wherever Marines fought, they held, and wherever they held, they won. This was the island where Japanese soldiers learned something they would never forget, something whispered around campfires and studied inside strategic war rooms. The U.S. Marines did not fear death. The Japanese believed fear was the strongest weapon in war. On Guadalcanal, that weapon failed, and a new legend was born, terrifying, unstoppable, unbreakable. That legend would follow the Marines across the Pacific, from Tarawa to Peleliu, from Saipan to Iwo Jima. It would become a shadow presence in every Japanese trench, bunker, tunnel, and foxhole. It would change the course of the war. But the real reason Japanese soldiers feared U.S. Marines is not just about battle, not just about blood, not just about courage. It is about something at the core of human survival, something deeper than strategy, deeper than weapons, deeper than nationality. And that truth is still waiting to be revealed. This is only the beginning.
The story of why Japanese soldiers feared U.S. Marines did not end with Guadalcanal. That was only the opening chapter of a much darker, more violent truth. If Guadalcanal proved Marines could fight, Tarawa proved something even more terrifying. Marines could not be stopped. Tarawa was a speck of volcanic coral in the middle of the Pacific, barely 2 miles long. On a map it looked harmless, a forgotten fragment of land that held no beauty, no comfort, no shelter. But to the U.S. military, Tarawa was a doorway. If it fell, the road to the Marshall Islands would open. If it held, Japan could still defend the Pacific. The Japanese emperor had been warned that Marines were not like other soldiers. Reports from Guadalcanal described them as relentless, fearless, impossible to break. But Japanese commanders believed Tarawa was different. They believed no army on earth could survive what waited there. They turned Tarawa into a fortress, bunkers cut deep into earth, tunnels snaking beneath sand, machine gun nests overlapping fire zones, beaches laced with mines, and jagged coral reefs designed to tear landing craft apart. They swore the Marines would die before even touching shoreline. The commander, Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, boasted that not even 1 million Americans could take Tarawa in 100 years. When the Marines of the 2nd Division approached the island on November 20, 1943, the sea was calm, but the air trembled with tension. Many had survived Guadalcanal and carried the scars and shadows of that fight. Others were new, young faces who had never fired a weapon in anger. All of them could feel the eyes of history on their backs. They had heard the rumors. They had heard the Japanese believed Tarawa was impenetrable. They had heard that no man could live through what was coming, and still they went forward.
The pre-landing bombardment shook the ocean. Battleships thundered fire into the island for hours, turning sand into smoke, metal, and fire. The Marines watched from the ships with a mix of awe and dread. Some believed the bombardment would flatten the island completely. Others were afraid it had done nothing at all. When the naval guns fell silent, smoke roiled over Tarawa like volcanic ash. Shapes moved in the haze, shadows rose, and then the moment came. The landing craft surged forward, engines roared, salt water sprayed into the air. The Marines braced for bullets, teeth clenched, hands locked on rifles. What they got was worse. The tide, miscalculated by Navy planners, was too shallow for the amphibious vehicles to reach the beach. Troops were forced to jump overboard hundreds of yards from shore, sinking into waist-deep or chest-deep water. Packs dragged them down, rifles went under. The coral beneath their feet was jagged and sharp, and ahead the Japanese machine guns opened fire. Men fell instantly. Some sank beneath the surface without a sound. Others tried to run through water that pulled at them like ropes. The sea turned red. Marines were pinned, unable to dive for cover, unable to charge forward. Still, they moved. Inch by inch, step by step, they pushed toward shore, every movement a battle between survival and death. Some crawled across coral reefs torn open by gunfire, bleeding into the waves. Those who reached the sand were met by walls of fire. Japanese soldiers later wrote in diaries that they had never seen such madness. They could not understand why Marines kept coming. They believed any other army would have turned back. But the Marines did not turn back. They clawed forward until they reached the seawall, the first protective barrier of the island. It was little more than a splintered pile of wood and logs, but to the Marines who survived to crossing, it was salvation. They huddled behind it, panting, bleeding, shaking, and then they rose.
Grenades exploded over the wall. Marines charged through breach points with bayonets fixed.
The machine gun nests that had seemed invincible suddenly found men storming their flanks. The Japanese defenders were stunned. They had inflicted horrifying casualties. They had watched hundreds of Marines die. But the surviving Marines moved with purpose that felt inhuman. They went from bunker to bunker, trench to trench, clearing each one in brutal close-quarter combat. Knives flashed, rifles fired at point-blank range, men grappled in sand soaked with blood. Tarawa was supposed to be a fortress. Instead, it became a slaughter ground. The Japanese defenders refused to surrender, not a single one. When cornered, they chose death over capture. The Marines, hardened by Guadalcanal and shaped by training that demanded aggression, responded in kind. Survival was not just a hope, it was a command. Every step forward was purchased at terrible cost. Bodies lay in tangled rows along the shore, uniforms shredded, helmets cracked open. The sun bore down with cruel heat, and the stench of gunpowder and death mixed into the air. Yet even in that hell, the Marines never fell back. They did not retreat, they did not freeze, they adapted. Platoons reorganized themselves on the fly as officers fell one by one. Young corporals and privates took command. Men who had never led before suddenly guided entire sections through chaos. This was what Japanese soldiers feared most, Americans who did not fall apart when leaders died. Americans who became stronger under pressure. By the second day, the Japanese defenders realized the truth. The Marines had not only reached the island, they were not leaving. Panic spread through the tunnel network. Orders were shouted, then choked by fear. Veteran Japanese troops who had believed Tarawa untouchable now whispered another word: inevitable. They knew they would die there. What shocked them was that the Marines were willing to die with them, just to take the island.
The fighting only grew more violent. The Marines fought without sleep, without food, and with ammunition running dangerously low. They battled in conditions no human body was meant to endure: heat that boiled the air, smoke that burned the throat, sand that stuck to every wound. They drank water from puddles contaminated by blood. Still, they moved forward. One Marine described Tarawa in a single sentence: "Hell was real, and it had a shoreline." The Japanese refused to surrender. They charged in suicidal waves at night, screaming, firing blindly into the sand. Some detonated grenades in their own hands rather than be captured. Others played dead, then rose up to strike. But every attack ended the same way, with the Marines holding the field. By the end of the third day, the island was nearly silent. The last Japanese defenders gathered in the remaining bunkers, surrounded and injured, waiting for dawn. At sunrise, they launched one final charge, a desperate, hopeless run that ended beneath Marine rifles and machine guns. When the sun rose fully over Tarawa, it shone on devastation. Over 1,000 Marines were dead. Nearly every Japanese soldier, more than 4,000, lay scattered across the island. It was then that surviving Japanese officers began to whisper something new to each other, something that would spread across the Pacific like ghost stories in the dark. They said that Marines were not afraid to attack impossible positions. They were not afraid to die. They fought past pain, past exhaustion, past reason. They fought as though their bodies had limits, but their will did not. The legend that began at Guadalcanal now had a foundation carved in blood. Marines were not just fierce, they were unstoppable. They were the storm that never broke. The Japanese commanders warned their troops that meeting Marines again would mean facing death itself. Across the Pacific, men who had never seen a Marine trembled at the stories told by those who had. Yet the real reason Japanese soldiers feared U.S. Marines had still not been revealed, not fully, not completely. Something deeper remained hidden beneath these battles, waiting in the shadows of an even darker island. To understand why Japan feared the Marines more than any other Allied force, we must go to the next battleground, a place more violent, more chaotic, more desperate than Tarawa or Guadalcanal, a place called Peleliu. On September 15, 1944, the island of Peleliu waited beneath a blazing Pacific sun. It was small, jagged, and hard, a coral mound no bigger than a city suburb. Yet within this hardened landscape lay a new Japanese strategy, a brutal evolution born from the lessons of Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Japanese commanders no longer believed they could stop the Marines at the shoreline. They no longer believed the Americans were soft. They no longer believed U.S. forces would break. The Pacific War had changed, and so had Japan's approach. On Peleliu, Japanese defenders would not meet Marines on the beach. They would drag them into the island's core, into caves and tunnels, into a maze of rock and fire. The ocean had already tested Marines. Tarawa had already drowned them in blood. Peleliu would test something deeper, the limits of human endurance. The Marines who stepped off the landing craft that morning were not the same men who had stormed Guadalcanal 2 years earlier. They were harder now, scarred by memories that clung to them like sweat on skin. Some had nightmares of towerless beaches, water turning red, and men sinking beneath waves with silent screams. Others remembered the endless jungle night on Guadalcanal, fighting enemies they could not see. But they had also learned something powerful about themselves. They could survive anything. That belief, that iron certainty, is what made them terrifying to the Japanese. The naval bombardment began before the first Marine touched sand. Battleships and cruisers hammered Peleliu for 3 days. Columns of smoke twisted into the air, blotting out the sun and filling the horizon with gray thunderclouds. Observers believed the island was broken, that nothing living could possibly survive beneath that firestorm. But deep inside the coral ridges, Japanese troops sat hidden in tunnels and chambers carved with surgical precision. They waited in silence, untouched by the bombardment, knowing the Marines believed the island was already theirs.
When the landing began, the eastern beaches of Peleliu erupted with chaos. The tide was higher than expected. The air was boiling. Machine guns opened fire from hidden positions high in the ridges. Mortars whistled down like falling stones. The Marines charged forward across sand so hot it burned through boots. The heat was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Sweat evaporated before it formed. Breath felt like swallowing fire. And within minutes, the battlefield revealed a truth that chilled everyone who survived the first wave. The naval bombardment had done nothing. The island was very much alive. Japanese machine gun nests tore through the first units, cutting down entire platoons in seconds. Men carried flamethrowers into the ridges and tunnels, only to find themselves ambushed by rifle fire from invisible angles. The air stank of burned metal, melted flesh, and exploded coral. The ground shook constantly, as though the island itself resented the presence of war. But the Marines pressed on. They crawled through the heat, dragging wounded comrades across rocks that shredded hands and knees. They fought from crater to crater, every explosion sending shards of coral slicing into skin. The Japanese strategy was clear. Do not stop Marines at the beach. Bleed them dry inside. This was not a battle of days or weeks. It was designed to be a battle of months, slow, grinding, relentless, and that is exactly what happened. As Marines pushed inland, the ridges rose around them. Umurbrogol Mountain, a labyrinth of caves and jagged rock formations that provided the perfect killing ground. Night brought no relief. The temperature remained suffocating. Water supplies ran low. Men collapsed from heat stroke. Skin blistered under the sun. Even the air tasted like dust and salt and smoke. The Japanese emerged from openings in the ridges like ghosts, firing and disappearing before Marines could respond. It was a nightmare unlike anything seen in the Pacific until then. But the Marines adapted. They studied the ridges, learned the patterns, understood the enemy's routes. They used flamethrowers to flush out caves, grenades to collapse tunnels, and coordinated rifle teams to hunt down snipers positioned high above the battlefield. The fighting was intimate, brutal, and deeply personal. Men looked into each other's eyes before they killed. They felt breath on their skin. They heard the final gasps of enemies who refused surrender.
Japanese soldiers on Peleliu witnessed something that haunted them. The Marines refused to give up ground, even when water was nearly gone, even when ammunition grew scarce, even when the temperature soared past 110 degrees, they did not break. One Marine wrote later that the island was hotter than hell and twice as deadly, but they stayed because no one else would do it if we didn't. That sentence revealed something deeper than strength. It revealed purpose. The battle stretched on longer than anyone expected. What was supposed to last 3 days dragged into weeks, then into months. The Marines suffered terrible losses. Units that had arrived at full strength were reduced to fragments. Men who had stared death in the eyes at Tarawa now saw something worse, the slow decay of their own humanity. They fought because there was no other choice. Sleep became a luxury. Food became memory. The only constant was combat. For the Japanese defenders, something shifted. At first, they had believed the Marines were unstoppable because of numbers, weapons, or technology. But on Peleliu, they saw the truth. Numbers dwindled, weapons jammed, technology failed, yet Marines moved forward anyway. They screamed in the face of danger. They charged into fire. They wiped tears, blood, and sweat from their eyes and kept going. Japanese diaries recovered after the battle spoke of the same realization. Marines fought beyond reason. They fought beyond human capacity. They fought for each other, for those they had lost, and for the knowledge that stopping meant dying.
Japanese survivors began whispering a phrase that later spread through their ranks, a phrase filled with awe and dread. They called the Marines Shinigami, death gods, not because Marines wanted death, but because they carried it with them. By November 1944, Peleliu was silent. The ridges were shattered, the tunnels collapsed, the beaches littered with wreckage. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay buried beneath the island. Many had sealed themselves inside caves rather than surrender. Of the original Japanese garrison, only a few hundred survived. The Marines had won, but victory tasted bitter. Casualties were staggering. Entire battalions were devastated. Peleliu proved what Guadalcanal hinted and Tarawa confirmed. Marines would endure anything to achieve their objective. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders studied the reports. They analyzed radio transmissions, battlefield notes, and diary entries. And what they found was more terrifying than any single battle. The Marines were feared because they were not perfect soldiers. They were feared because they were imperfect humans who fought through exhaustion, terror, and pain. They were feared because they made mistakes and kept going. They were feared because they had limits and still pushed past them. They were feared because they were ordinary men who became extraordinary when the world collapsed around them. This was the truth Japan had not expected, and it was the truth the Marines carried into every battle that followed, including the final, bloodiest confrontation on Iwo Jima, where the world would witness the flag rising over Mount Suribachi, a symbol not of dominance, but of endurance.
When Japanese soldiers spoke of Marines in those final years of the war, they did so with a mixture of fear and respect.
They told stories of men who charged through machine gun fire, who rose after being shot, who fought until their bodies could not move. They believed Marines had no fear of death because they had already faced it and returned. And beneath those stories lived a deeper truth, the truth that began on Guadalcanal, sharpened on Tarawa, and defined on Peleliu. The real reason Japanese soldiers feared U.S. Marines was not brutality or violence or strength. It was the Marines' ability to transform suffering into power. It was their refusal to surrender, their refusal to retreat, their refusal to let fear dictate fate. Marines believed something stronger than fear, something that no bullet, no flame, no darkness could destroy. They believed in each other. And here, after all the blood and thunder of war, lies the mystery you have been waiting to understand. You were told at the beginning that the real truth would be revealed at the end, and now it can be spoken plainly. Japanese soldiers did not fear Marines because they were perfect warriors. They feared them because they were men who kept going, even when their bodies, minds, and spirits screamed for mercy. They feared them because Marines fought not for glory or revenge, but for survival, for honor, and for the brother standing beside them. This is the brutal human truth that reshaped the Pacific War, the same truth that echoed across every island battlefield and into the final surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. Fear is not born from strength alone, it is born from resolve, and in the Pacific, no force on earth had resolve like the United States Marines.